Zach, I'm going to ask you two questions over the course of this recording, and I want you to decide now which one you'd like to answer. So the first one is going to be pretty philosophical and deep.
Okay.
The other one, less so. So would you rather start with the more philosophical question or the one that's a little bit more easygoing?
Let's start with the one that's more easygoing as a way to build into the whole show.
Sure. Zach, do you believe in aliens?
I don't know. I don't really have an opinion about the existence of aliens. If they exist, they're out there, cool. If not, they're not. It hasn't affected my life yet, and it won't until it does. What about you?
Yeah, I guess. I don't know. I also likewise. I think that there's been like a heightened, maybe not curiosity, but like conspiracy theory put on my tin hat, like discussion about aliens recently. You know, with like U.S. government talks about unidentified flying object. Whoa, like what does this mean? You know, and it just doesn't really interest me. But I would think that there's probably some other life out there, maybe not in the way that aliens have been caricatured in like pop culture, but I don't know. I think that there could be some amoeba somewhere floating around doing its thing. You know, why
Yeah.
not?
Didn't someone say, and I don't remember who it was, but there's some famous statement that uh, goes something like, two possibilities exist. Either we are alone in the universe or we are not, and both are terrifying.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, we've got each other, and we've got this podcast, so maybe we can find comfort in that.
In the words of the great BoJack Horseman, in this terrifying world, all we have are the connections that we make.
Oh, this is beautiful. And you know what else is beautiful? Our topic of the podcast today. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Source Material. My name is Russell Loebscher.
And I'm Zachary K.
And today we are going to be talking about Story of Your Life by Ted Chiang and Arrival by Denis Villeneuve, or should I say directed by Denis Villeneuve. Source Material is a podcast in which we take the source material, such as a story, book, novella, and compare and contrast it with its adaptation, film, TV show, and the like. And today, we've arrived. I think most people would probably be familiar with Arrival as a film. It came out in 2016. We are going to talk about Story of Your Life first, the story that was then adapted to the film. But I think I may be wrong here, but like me, I think you probably watched the movie first before reading the story. Is that correct?
Yeah, I don't actually remember. I was trying to think about it over the last week as we were preparing for this, when I first saw Arrival, and I'm actually not sure. I think I watched it on an airplane, but I'm not sure when that would have been or where I was going at the time. It might have been in 2018. Yeah, I'm just not sure. But yes, definitely before the story. I didn't even realize it was based on a short story until you mentioned this a couple weeks ago.
Yeah. It's interesting that you'd watched it mid-flight. I would have thought that you would have watched it right after you landed.
Ah, I see.
Yeah. Sorry. Well, I watched the movie. I think shortly. I watched it in theaters when it came out, but I didn't watch the whole thing. So it was 2016 in the fall. I remember driving to visit a friend in Vancouver, Washington. I was going to go watch this sci-fi movie that I didn't really know anything about, and hit traffic. But finally arrived at, I want to say, a Regal Cinema. And jumped into the film probably about a third of the way in and didn't have any idea what was going on. I thought it looked cool. Thought Amy Adams and Jeremy Renner, the stars of the film, were doing great work, but just most of the film was lost on me, and then left the movie theater and went to Red Robin. Yum. And that was the evening. And it wasn't until later that when I watched the film for the second time that I realized this is probably one of my favorite movies. I would say it's in top 5. I've really, really enjoyed the film. So I'm very excited to talk to you about it, and also its short story. Um, so with that, let's talk about Story of Your Life. So Story of Your Life was written by Ted Chiang. Ted Chiang is an American author. He was born in Port Jefferson, New York in 1967. His parents are from mainland China, but immigrated to Taiwan during the Cultural Revolution and then immigrated again to the United States. Ted Chiang has a Bachelor of Science degree in computer science from Brown, but since graduating from college would publish short stories and novelettes and novellas, and has been doing that since the mid to early to mid 90s. His novella "Story of Your Life" was first published in the science fiction and fantasy anthology series Starlight 2. It won the 2000 Nebula Award for Best Novella and won the 1999 Theodore Sturgeon Award. Theodore Sturgeon, I didn't know this, had to look it up, was a leading author in the golden age of science fiction, which is this period of time between 1939 and 1950. And from 1987 to 1994, the award was given out by a panel of science fiction experts. It was led by Orson Scott Card, which was really interesting, namely because Ender's Game is a book that I know that you cherish, right? It's a book that you really enjoy. Got that correct?
I really liked Ender's Game. The movie I haven't seen all the way through, but maybe that's a discussion for another episode of this show.
Yeah. So I guess we should probably just talk like science fiction in general. Have you read a lot of science fiction?
Yeah, that's a tough question because a lot is so subjective. I have read a decent amount of science fiction. I read a lot of sort of pop fantasy sci-fi lit as a kid. I read a lot of like Star Wars Extended Universe throughout grade school. And as an adult, my forays into literature haven't been really strictly sci-fi. I've read a handful of novels. I tend to read more sort of, I guess, postmodern magical realism kind of stuff. Does that sound like an appropriate answer? I don't know why I'm asking you that question. It's a fine answer. It's the answer that I have.
No, it's great.
You talk now.
Sure. I too like science fiction a decent amount, and I apologize for framing it with a lot that was very unhelpful. But science fiction, I think, certainly when it comes to film, I don't want to touch about this too much because we are going to be talking about the movie quite extensively, is one of my favorite genres. I haven't read a lot of science fiction, maybe the big hits like Dune. I read that a couple of years ago and enjoyed it a decent amount, but I wouldn't say I'm a hardcore science fiction fan, although whenever I do come across it, I do find myself really enjoying it. And I don't really know. I think that like well-made science fiction, obviously, definitely like, even though it may be set in sort of this future that is removed from our contemporary reality, it definitely oftentimes points a lens towards like our current like experience. And I think that that's, if it's done well, I think that can be, frankly, just quite cool and definitely quite thought-provoking. So that's what I enjoy about it.
Yeah, I agree. It's a way to discuss contemporary issues without being too on the nose about contemporary issues when done correctly, as you said. I have a question about this. You and I both read The Memory Police by Ogawa, maybe?
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
Would you categorize that as science fiction?
Oh, putting me on the spot with trying to remember that book. That is, which is very funny, given that I think if I remember correctly, it was the society in which the memories were being taken away by some seemingly like omniscient force, right?
It was like the government, right? And they had the memory police who would go and make sure that no evidence of the things of which memories had been taken away remained.
Yeah. Yes, I would. I think that I don't think it was ever explicitly stated how they were removing the memories. I think that that was, frankly, like not really important, unless, of course, you can tell me otherwise. But it was more so how people dealt with that, right? And I think that that is relative to, well, not relative, but maybe connects to how governments and in power that have the ability to influence people with like withholding information, right? That was, I think, the conclusion that we had reached when we talked about this book, which was maybe like a year ago.
Yeah.
Am I am I remembering correctly, or is the memory police taking that part?
Yeah, I think that's right. Uh, my question was because it's never really explicitly established as science fiction, or like you said, we're not given the how, we're not given the why, and so for me, it sort of borders the genre between science fiction or magical realism.
Yeah,
And I was just curious what your take, since we're discussing the genre sci-fi overall. Like,
yeah.
what
No, I
makes
think,
something sci-fi to you is the crux of the question.
yeah. Uh, I don't know what makes something science fiction to you.
Well, I have to imagine that the dictionary definition involves extrapolating scientific developments, right? So like spaceships or supercomputers or laser guns, that sort of
Mm.
technology. I think the genre has broadened past that in some ways. Like
Yeah,
I would probably call most dystopian works science fiction, um, even if it's sort of like less tech-y than things are now, if only because generally it was caused by an over extrapolation of science in world, right?
yeah.
Um,
Why don't we talk about the big, like, I guess, topic of science fiction today, which is AI. And the reason I bring that up is because we've seen a lot of films this year, such as The Creator, the new Mission Impossible film, um, center like itself around AI and the threat that it possibly could pose, or like the benefit that it could pose, right? And the reason I bring it up is because Ted Chiang, the author of Story of Your Life, he was named to Time Magazine's 100 most influential people in AI.
hmm.
Um, now, I don't really know what that means. I didn't go and look at the full list, but it was kind of broken down into like leaders and innovators and shapers and thinkers. The leaders were going to obviously be people that were like CEOs and presidents of various corporations, like OpenAI, for example, or
Sure.
Google, DeepMind. Um, Elon Musk, of course, being sort of a like large figure in this space. But I was interested to hear what Ted Chiang had to say. So he's a writer, okay, and so this is just a little blurb from his I guess biography in this list. Ted Chiang is perhaps the world's most celebrated living science fiction author. His short, carefully honed stories explore how our inner worlds and our societies would react to unexpected rifts in the fabric of science. How would it feel to receive a hormone injection that drastically improved your cognitive function? What if learning an alien language changed the way you perceive time? And if humanity were to create artificial life, what obligations would we owe it? Recently, Chang, 56, has stepped into a new role. In nonfiction pieces for The New Yorker, he has emerged as one of the sharpest critics of AI and the corporations behind it. In one viral piece, he compared ChatGPT to a, quote, a blurry JPEG of the web,
Hmm.
arguing that the very technology that makes the app so fluent is the reason for his inability to separate truth from fiction. In another, he took aim at the structures of power that new AI advances both arose from and reinforce. Without structural economic changes, he argued, the rise of AI threatens to worsen wealth inequality, weaken worker power, and fortify a tech oligarchy. What does progress even mean if it doesn't include better lives for people who work? He wrote. What is the point of greater efficiency if the money being saved isn't going anywhere except into shareholders' bank accounts? Ah, Ted Chiang, my boy.
What
We
a
love you
what
so
an
much.
absolute statement. That's a powerhouse. I now want to read that article, and if I remember to do so, I will link it in the show notes for those of you who are interested in reading it as well, because that sounds very similar to my thoughts on AI.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think certainly nice to have that uh, validation from what they consider the most prolific science fiction author
Most
currently out
celebrated,
doing.
right?
Celebrated. Sorry, celebrated. Yeah. Um, okay. So should we jump into story of your life, the story that that we're going to base this podcast on?
Yeah, let's do it. I'm eager.
Okay. So, as mentioned, he first wrote this in 1998, and it was adapted into the film Arrival in 2016. So, slightly less than 20 years between the story and the adaptation. So, I suppose I'd ask you, Zach, what was your initial reaction reading the story, and then we can jump into sort of a general summary of what happens.
Pure delight. If I
Pure
had to
delight.
sum it up, yeah, this is just one of the most delightful short stories I've ever read. I think I said maybe to you or to someone else that it's one of those pieces that makes you feel enlightened as you are reading it.
Yeah.
It's brilliantly executed. Even knowing what happens because I've seen the film and knowing the like quote unquote twist, right? It was so thoroughly enjoyable. I cannot say enough good things about this novella.
Ah, that's fantastic. Yeah, likewise. I enjoyed it immensely. It is, yeah, deeply affecting. Is maybe the most concise way I can put reading the story, and I think that many people who are fans of Ted Chiang or fans of science fiction have a likewise sort of opinion of it. Do we? Is it a novella or a short story? I just want to make sure that we're staying
I
consistent.
genuinely do not know the difference.
We'll just call it a novella because it won the 2000 Nebula Award for Best Novella. So we'll just
Great.
go with that going forward. On this A4 printout I have, it's 39 pages or just shy of 39 pages. So it's fairly long. I think it took me like about an hour and 15 minutes to read, somewhere there. But anyway, certainly not like a short story that you can just knock out in like 20 minutes, but definitely shorter than a novel.
Yeah.
So maybe that is the perfect definition of a novella.
Great.
Anyway.
I imagine there's like a word count definition somewhere that nobody really cares about, I guess. But I like the word novella. I'm fine going forward with that.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So, story of your life centers around Dr. Louise Banks, and she is a linguist. And the essential, I guess, big event that happens within the story is that aliens show up. Not physically, but we are made aware of their existence. And the story sort of moves forward in like, how do we understand them? How do we communicate with them? How would we use like language techniques to understand something that we previously have no knowledge of, right? And likewise, how would we make sure that they could understand us? And so in addition to that, it sort of goes back and forth between the description of Dr. Louise Banks trying to communicate with these alien life forms and a recount of her experience with her daughter. So the story opens up with the following paragraph. Your father is about to ask me the question. This is the most important moment in our lives, and I want to pay attention, note every detail. Your dad and I have just come back from an evening out, dinner and a show. It's after midnight. We came out onto the patio and looked at the full moon. Then I told your dad I wanted to dance. So he humors me, and now we're slow dancing. A pair of 30-somethings swaying back and forth in the moonlight like kids. I don't feel the night chill at all. And then your dad says, do you want to make a baby? And so what we see here is the sort of the beginning of not only the story, but the beginning of Dr. Louise Banks' child's story. And then it doesn't sort of follow in sequence like a child goes from, birth to toddler to child to teenager and then to adulthood, but sort of flips back and forth within the story. And that obviously is done rather intentionally. Anything about the opening, Zach, before we get into some of the more details?
It really frames what the story is about, right? Because yes, as you said, aliens come to Earth, and that's sort of what happens. That is maybe the plot of the novella. But it is, as the title suggests, the story of your life, and in this context, the you is Dr. Banks's daughter. So this grounds us in that very human sort of moment amidst a somewhat broader sci-fi plot. What do you think, Russ?
Yeah, no, exactly. I think let's talk about that broader sci-fi moment, and then we'll come back to the more emotional and personal aspects of the story. So, do you want to just discuss just generally what happens, kind of moving through that plot?
Yeah. So in the novella, an alien race which are named the heptapods because they have 7 sort of leg type appendages, and then their bodies are kind of like pods, heaven sept, come to Earth, not physically, as you said, Russell, but by dropping hundreds of essentially TV screens on the Earth. And Dr. Banks is recruited by the military to come and try to learn how to communicate with the aliens and ask them, like, who are you? Why are you here? What do you want? She's partnered up.
They send exactly 112, and they spread them out across the world. They are nicknamed looking glasses, but they're like a semicircular mirror. But you're right, like essentially like a TV.
Yeah, that's good added detail. She's teamed up with a physicist who I think in the novella is named Greg. Is that right? I'm not looking at my notes.
His name is Gary.
Gary, that's right. I always get those two names mixed up.
Dr. Gary Donnelly.
Thank you. And over the course of working together, they fall in love, which is one aspect of it, and that's probably more present in the novella than in the film. But also, Dr. Banks learns that the heptapods have essentially 2 languages. They have their spoken language, and then they have their written language. And the written language, unlike human languages, does not correspond to the spoken language. For example, in English, we write out words in the same order that we would speak them to convey meaning. But the heptapod language uses a series of pictographs that convey meaning based on how they are arranged. She also, over the course of working with these heptapods, learns that a sentence in written heptapod, which is called heptapod B in the story, is written fluidly in one pen stroke, which tells her that in order to communicate in this language, you have to know the entirety of your sentence before you start writing it. And that's the only way that you could write it out in one sentence, which is, again, very different from how humans communicate. I certainly, and probably you, Russell, and probably those of you listening at home, start speaking without knowing where the end of a sentence is going to be, sort of like how I just did that one, fairly frequently, because we experience things in a linear, often unplanned way. This discovery about heptapod B then leads Dr. Banks to understand that the heptapods experience time differently. And through learning their language, so does Dr. Banks. And that's the crux of the story without going into the family stuff, which is that, and I guess I don't have to worry about spoilers here. If you've made it this far and you haven't watched these films and you're worried about spoilers, you really clearly, obviously should not be listening to this, but you should have thought of that like 20 minutes ago. So, Dr. Banks's daughter dies in the novella in a hiking accident, and
Yeah, like on the fourth page of the novella. So
yeah,
it's not something that's revealed at the end. It's quite deliberately stated very early on in the story.
right, which I guess it matters, right? Um, and then we learn, which is revealed later, that that hasn't happened yet in the contemporary now of her work with the heptapods, and that the father of her child is Gary, the physicist she's working with, and all of that is going to happen in her future, but she's experiencing it through memories or flash forwards, if you like, Lost. Um, Now, I say making air quotes because she is learning to experience time the way that the heptapods do, which is all at once and not linear, just everything is kind of happening at the same time, and we know that, and that's fine. That's just how it is for them, which brings up a lot of interesting like philosophical questions about things like free will. And I don't know if you'd like to talk about that now, or if you'd like to wait until we've gone into the film and sort of compare how the two address those points, Russell.
Yeah, let's wait. Let's wait on that. Yeah, thank you, Vet, for that. That was really well said. I think that some great details that Chang includes in the story is, you know, the literal description of the aliens themselves. So we have here, it looked like a barrel suspended at the intersection of 7 limbs. So as you mentioned, they are heptapods. They have 7 limbs. It was radially symmetric, and any of its limbs could serve as an arm or a leg. The one in front of me was walking around on 4 legs, 3 non-adjacent arms curled up at its sides. Gary called them heptapods, so they get that name. And then later, just towards a little bit further on, eerie but logical, with eyes on all sides, any direction might as well be forward. So even in the construction of their bodies, there is no front and back. They are essentially just like cyclical within like their own being, right? They embody how they understand time, as you put it. So yeah, I think really, as we've maybe outlined already, the story sort of flip flops between Dr. Louise Banks and Gary working together to try to understand the aliens. There's a lot of detailed and technical writing done about grammar and language and linguistics, which I found rather amazing that Chang had the ability to do. I know that in 2002 he started working as a technical writer for a tech company, so maybe he already had this knowledge within him, but there are sections of the text where I just had to like read over like 3 or 4 times to get any sort of semblance of meaning from what he was trying to say. An example of this is much more interesting were the newly discovered morphological and grammatical processes in heptapod B that were uniquely 2-dimensional. So this is describing the written language of the heptapods. That's another thing, right? The heptapods, they're given these interesting names, Flapper and Raspberry, because of the way that they sound. So they kind of like, their language reminded me of that one episode of SpongeBob where they go like down into the canyon and it's just like, I can't understand your accent, which I thought very, very couldn't get out of my head for a little bit. I was giggling to myself. But yeah, so the heptapod A, the spoken language is, I guess, how you would describe, frankly, for like lack of a better term, like flatulence, right? Am I mistaken there, Zach? It's kind of like
I think
like,
they describe it in the novella as a fluttering sound.
yes.
Which is maybe a kinder way of saying that.
Yeah, okay. So they're given the name Flapper and Raspberry, and then there's heptapod A and heptapod B, which is, as you've already outlined, Zach, heptapod A is the spoken language, heptapod B is the written language. So here they're talking about the written language. Depending on a semigram's declension, inflections could be indicated by varying a certain stroke's curvature or its thickness or its manner of undulation, or by varying the relative sizes of two radicals, or their relative distance to another radical, or their orientations, or various other means. These were non-segmental graphemes. They couldn't be isolated from the rest of a semigram, and despite how such traits behaved in human writing, these had nothing to do with calligraphic style. Their meanings were defined according to a consistent and unambiguous grammar. That is there's some technical words in there, and I mean, I am an English teacher, and I had to go over that multiple times to try to understand that, basically, this is an entirely different way of thinking about writing. It is in itself sort of like a symbol, in which different variations within the symbols can have different meanings to create a different sentence. But yeah, pretty technical. Did you find yourself, I don't know, brushing up against that in any way, or did you sort of just did you understand it and just flow through the story with relative ease?
I stopped and thought about it. Yeah, partly because these are words that I was unfamiliar with and had not encountered before. I am not an English teacher, or a linguistician.
Linguist?
Linguist. Thank you. Yeah. Wow. I overcomplicated that one.
Linguistician is cool.
But I think I generally understood from context. I may have looked up one or two words. It was fascinating. I actually, after finishing the story, did Google some things just because I was curious about some of these concepts, especially the one about, and I can't remember, is it Fermat's theorem, maybe, about how light refracts in a way to either reach its destination in the shortest or longest possible amount of time.
Yeah.
Which is not necessarily, okay, I actually am going to tangent on this because I did Google that, and I'm definitely not a physician, but the way it was conveyed in the story did not exactly match what I read about the current understanding of that theorem. So I think Ted Chiang took a little bit of thematic liberty with that to tell his story a little bit better, which I thought was fine. It's fiction.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, for all the physicians out there that may take issue with him kind of molding principles of light refractory to benefit the story, take it up with Ted. But I think for us, it worked within the context of the story, right?
Absolutely.
So I think it's a good point to sort of jump back to the more personal side of the story. And so, as we mentioned, the story of your life is about Dr. Louise Banks and her daughter, who we find out is the child that she had with Gary. So the birth of of her daughter occurs, I guess, if you were thinking about it chronologically, after the aliens have left. So what happens at the end of the story, when it sort of not breaks down, but the resolution of the bit in which Dr. Louise Banks is trying to understand the aliens, and we try to figure out why they came, is there's a sharing of information, and then at some point the aliens just say, "We're done," and they leave. And we're sort of left wondering what the purpose of it was, but we'll get to that in just a second. Happening, if we're thinking about this chronologically, after this, Dr. Louise Banks and Gary Donnelly have a child, and spread throughout the narrative of the aliens are little snippets or little pieces of their child's life. And it jumps around, right? So it opens up with obviously a description of, before she was born, and then it may jump to when she's 3 years old, and then it may jump to her college graduation. But near the beginning, we get an understanding that she dies when she is 25 due to a climbing accident. And I thought it was just really, really well done. There's a moment towards the end of the story when we understand that because the heptapods can understand time in a non-linear fashion. They understand the outcome of every event before it has even happened. There's a question that's posed, well, what's the point? If you know what the answer is going to be, why would you speak it? And Dr. Louise Banks says, well, oftentimes, you know, we say things as a sort of a performance with the intended purpose of just receiving that answer for, like as a marker of time, I think is the correct way of putting that. So there's an example in which, for the heptapods, all language was performative. Instead of using language to inform, they used language to actualize. Sure, heptapods already knew that what would be said in any conversation, but in order for their knowledge to be true, the conversation would have to take place. And then the example that Luis uses to kind of like affirm that is there's immediately after that section, it jumps into a section where she's telling a story of Goldilocks, but she's changing details, right? So she'll say like, oh, Papa Bear's porridge had asparagus in it, or Brussels sprouts, and Mama Bear's porridge had spinach, and her daughter is like, no, you got to say it the right way. And Luis goes, well, I'm reading just what it says here, I'll say, in all innocence. So she's just joking with her. And then her daughter goes, no, you're not. That's not how the story goes. And then Luis, well, if you already know how the story goes, why do you need me to read it to you? And then the daughter says, because I want to hear it, right? The important thing is the story. It is hearing the story from her mother, which I thought was really, really, I don't know, beautiful. Did you have other moments like that that really touched you within the story?
Yeah, I want to talk about that one a little bit, because that's really like, it's a commentary on storytelling, right? Is that knowing a story is not the same as experiencing it as it is told. And I would argue, which maybe is a little counter to the point of the novel, but maybe not also, that part of the joy is experiencing the narrative arc over time, right? Like reading the cliff notes of a great story is never, ever, ever the same experience as actually reading that story or watching the movie. And it's because the joy is in the telling of the story and hearing it. And sometimes that's the details that an author or a filmmaker or whoever includes. And sometimes it's just the literal existence of time as we hear this story. What do you think about that?
No, I think that's really well put. And you said that you think that this kind of like goes against the story. What do you mean by that?
Well, because in the story, Banks ends up not experiencing time linearly, which I wonder if that changes the way that we would relate to story in a way that is unfathomable to our linear human time brains.
Yeah.
So I don't know if it goes against the story, but it makes me wonder, like, because Ted Chiang is definitely talking about in that moment, demonstrating that experiencing it, even if you know what's going to happen, is different. But if you experience everything at once, do you ever actually experience anything?
Mm.
And maybe that's dumb, but I don't know. It's a wonder. There's something to wonder about.
Yeah, definitely. I think that we should jump to the film now, and then we'll kind of like come back to the story because they do differ in some ways. And I think that if we keep talking about the story, we're going to maybe touch upon those ideas before we've talked about the film in any meaningful way. Do you agree?
Yes, I agree. I'm actively semi-censoring myself to make sure that I don't say, because in the film they do it this way, and I think that. So yeah, go on.
Yeah. Okay, so let's jump to the film that was adapted from the story, and that is Arrival from 2016. It was directed by Denis Villeneuve, and the writer was a guy named Eric Heiserer. I think it's worth mentioning that Eric Heiserer is known for, and I say this um, maybe generously to Eric Heiserer. Um, Writing A Nightmare on Elm Street in 2010, Final Destination 5 in 2011, The Thing in 2011, which is a remake of John Carpenter's The Thing, Hours from 2013, Lights Out from 2016. All of these, I think, are like horrors or thriller that are not like super well reviewed, if I
That
can
is
remember right.
generous. That is
Yeah.
that's generous, especially considering
Okay.
like Nightmare on Elm Street and the Thing remake, which were not received well. Sub 30% Rotten Tomato scores.
There you go. Then Arrival, 2016. Then Bird Box, which was like a sort of a cultural phenomenon. Very briefly, it's that movie that came on Netflix where people couldn't see. I haven't seen it, but there you
I
go.
think Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross did the score for that and absolutely hated it. I think, and I could be wrong. So if I'm wrong, I'll probably just strike this from the podcast when I'm editing. But I'm pretty sure Trent Reznor called doing that movie a colossal waste of time.
Tough. Yeah, if only you couldn't hear it as well. Bloodshot from 2020, which stars Vin Diesel as sort of looks similar to like an 80s action movie, but like a B movie. And then since 2021 has done nothing but Shadow and Bone, which is a television show that I don't know anything about. I think that you maybe know a little bit more about it, but it seems to be, aside from Arrival, the most well received piece of work that he's done.
Yeah, I watched the first season of that when it came out maybe 2 years ago, maybe 1 year ago. I don't really know because I don't experience time in the correct way either. But I enjoyed it. I haven't read the novels they're based on, but I did enjoy the first season of that television show.
Yeah. Well, good. And I think that as we had talked about before, it's very interesting how many writers and as formerly filmmakers have now sort of been ushered into the world of like prestige television, doing like longer form pieces of storytelling. I'm not really sure how I feel about that, mostly because I haven't watched the shows, so I don't want to be like, these people could rather be spending their time working on movies, which is a medium that I typically enjoy more. But I don't know. I do think it is interesting that a lot of the creatives are sort of being pulled towards that side of like sort of visual entertainment rather than your typical film.
Yeah, it is interesting and maybe not worth getting into too much, but here maybe that's a topic for another time because I know you're more of a movies guy and I'm actually more of a TV guy when it comes to comparing the two. So maybe we'll have to talk more about that
some other time. Let's talk about Denis. So Denis Villeneuve is a Canadian filmmaker. He was born on October 3rd, 1967 in Gentilly, Quebec. So Gentilly is the one I'm pushing up against there. I'm not sure. I don't want to bastardize it in the French language. Please, apologies, our French listeners. And he was awarded the prize of Director of the Decade by the Hollywood Critics Association in December 2019. So Villeneuve is pretty well known, as I say, sort of recently, and sort of as acclaimed as sort of a director, particularly in the sci-fi space. I would say since Arrival came out. So his filmography, he made his first feature film in 1998 called August 32nd on Earth. Then he followed that with Maelstrom, then Polytechnique, then Incendie. And then I think the success of Incendie, these are sort of like thriller drama films, propelled him into sort of Hollywood, in which he created both Prisoners and Enemy in 2013. Prisoners stars Jake Gyllenhaal and Hugh Jackman, and by all accounts is good, but tough to watch. I'll leave it at that. Sicario was probably his biggest success prior to Arrival. So Sicario came out in 2015. He then released Arrival in 2016, and then has since done nothing but science fiction. So Blade Runner 2049 in 2017, and then Dune Part 1 2021, and then the sequel to Dune Part 1, Dune Part 2, which was slated to come out at the end of this year, is now set to come out in March next year. What are you laughing at?
I just think it's very funny that to introduce the sequel to Dune Part 1, which is called Dune Part 2, it's just something about that tickled me. Like, yes, the sequel to Part 1 is Part 2.
Yes.
Tune
Apologies.
in more for more insight. No, it was a small moment of joy.
No, I deserve it. So yeah, I mean, he is somebody who enjoys science fiction clearly, and I think that he had mentioned in an interview that Dune particularly was a book that he really loved as a child, and really had, like, as a filmmaker, it was something that he strove to put on screen. And so I very much like how we talked about last week with Wes Anderson having a love of Roald Dahl stories. He's sort of recreated some of those, and really wants to put that on screen. It's interesting how certain filmmakers just have these interests that they developed maybe when they were younger. Denis Villeneuve has talked about as a 12-year-old really falling in love with sci-fi because he was, quote, the worst hockey player in his town, and sort of directed his interest and energy more in that space, and has, since then not sort of lost the love of that, that genre of storytelling. So I think that's quite cool. A little bit about Arrival, the film. It stars, as we mentioned earlier, Amy Adams as Dr. Louise Banks. Jeremy Renner is not named Gary in the movie. He's rather named Ian. I don't know if they ever mentioned his last name. Didn't note that down.
It is Donnelly. It is Donnelly also, I believe, in the film.
Why do you think they changed it up? Do you think people would get confused between Gary and Greg?
I think Gary, yeah, well, definitely, I would personally. But I think everyone who was working on the movie, maybe particularly Eric Heisler, was just like, the name Gary kind of sucks, and we're going to make it Ian instead. So that's my personal headcanon, if you will.
Okay. Thank you for that. The film also stars Forrest Whitaker. He plays sort of a military lead, the one that sort of recruits Dr. Louise Banks to work on this project and work to try to understand these aliens. And then some other tertiary actors involved are Michael Stuhlbarg, who plays the head of the State Department that's afraid of the aliens doing something malicious if we give them anything, if we give them too much information. And then Sima, who is a Chinese actor who doesn't reflect anybody in the story, but certainly plays an important role in the film. General Shang, which we'll talk about, I'm sure. Anyway, the film premiered at the Venice Film Festival on September 1st, 2016, made a wide release on November 11th, 2016. It had a budget of $47 million and a global box office of $203 million. It was a time when non-Marvel films could still make money. And Arrival was nominated for 8 Academy Awards at the 89th Academy Awards, and it won for Best Sound Editing. So both commercially successful and critically acclaimed. We talked a little bit earlier, Zach, about our experiences watching Arrival for the first time. Yours perhaps on a plane, and then mine at a Regal, in which I watched 2/3 of the film, and then had probably a pretty average burger afterwards. But as I mentioned at the beginning, Arrival is one of my favorite movies. I would confidently say that it is in the top 5, and given Villeneuve's recent films, I would also confidently say that he is one of my favorite working directors in Hollywood. I loved Blade Runner 2049. Thought it was fantastic. And then I am a big fan of Dune Part 1, and I can't wait for the sequel, which is going to be called Dune Part 2.
Oh, it's so good.
uh,
It's one of those
yeah,
things that's like it's not funny, but I think it's very, very funny. Which is probably why
yeah.
I will never be a successful comedy writer. But there we are.
um, but yeah, let's let's talk about Arrival as a movie. So it opens up and has um, the song "On the Nature of Daylight" by Max Richter that just sort of hangs over this the scene as the camera sort of drops down onto um, a lake. A lake is in the background, and we see the interior of a home, and it's quite cool. I would say sort of the mood is quite cool. There's a couple of wine glasses on the table, and Amy Adams' voice sort of hangs over, in which she basically begins to describe the life of her daughter, who in the film is given the name Hannah. And I've written in the notes here that "On the Nature of Daylight" by Max Richter slaps so hard. Man, Zach, I really think that this is a beautiful piece of music. You are far better versed at sort of speaking about music, but did you enjoy this song? Please tell me you enjoyed this song. You didn't hate it. I guess
Yeah,
song
it's
is
lovely.
weird.
It's lovely. It's a lovely piece. I think it's used in a lot of soundtracks because it's so lovely. I haven't listened to it outside of seeing it in things, but it's very nice.
Yeah. Ah, thank you. Feel validated as a music uh, noob. No, noob's not the right word. A
Well,
music.
the nice thing about art is that you don't have to be an expert to appreciate it.
Cool. Thank you. Um, so the movie opens up very similarly to the story. Um, Louise Banks is describing the life of her daughter. We see it in a sequential way. So Hannah is born. There's a lovely scene in which Louise is playing with her in the yard. Then we jump to her being a teenager and sort of the heightened emotions that can bring, such as I don't know, her yelling at her mom for whatever reason, and then it is revealed that um, Hannah contracts a disease, a very rare disease that eventually ends with her death. And that part of the opening sees Louise Banks walking down a hallway before then cutting to a scene in which she is walking in a university classroom where she works as a linguist. Very well done, I think. And also, as you know, we've already talked about this in the context of the story, but if you had never read the story and you were just watching the film, it is constructed in a way that makes you think that what she is doing now, as sort of working as a linguist at the university, the experience of her daughter, that has already occurred. It is so we are now in the future. So she talks about her daughter's life, and then after her daughter passes away, she is now in the future, right? I'm correct there, right, Zach?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the story is kind of presents it in the same way. Like it certainly doesn't. It paints it as a memory instead of a future memory.
Yeah. The big difference there being that in the film, Hannah dies from an incurable disease, and I think like younger, right? I think we're led to believe that she never reached adulthood, whereas in the story, Hannah dies at the age of 25 rock climbing.
Yeah,
should we talk? You want to talk about that?
I do want to
Now?
talk about that because I think that's
Okay.
one of, if not the major philosophical differences in the two versions of this story.
Okay.
So I was reading an interview with Eric Heisserer, who, as we mentioned, wrote this adaptation, and he said that in the short story, the moral is basically that you know what's going to happen, but you go through it anyway because you don't have any free will, you don't have any choice.
And Heiser says he didn't particularly care for that, and he wanted to change it so that it was about Dr. Banks knowing that her daughter was going to die, but still choosing to have that daughter anyway. And so, therefore, in order to make that the moral, he had to make her die in a way that was unpreventable, as opposed to just being like, hey, don't go rock climbing today, which maybe brings up questions about the immutability of time. But it's a big change, and it's interesting too, because in an interview with Villeneuve that you linked in the notes, he says he doesn't agree with Heiser in that, and he says to him it's not about choice, but about finding joy in the moments, even knowing that there is going to be tragedy at the end of it. He says that, listen, I have kids, I know I'm going to die someday, they're going to die someday, but we still have to be present and engage with life and find joy in it. What do you think about those various interpretations of the story, Russell?
Yeah, no, I think, going back to the text itself, right, there's, towards the end, Louise talking about the heptapods, they act to create the future, to enact chronology. Knowledge of the future was incompatible with free will. What made it possible for me to exercise freedom of choice also made it impossible for me to know the future. Conversely, now that I know the future, because as we mentioned in the outline, Louise learns the language that the heptapods use, I would never act contrary to that future, including telling others what I know. Those who know the future don't talk about it. Interestingly enough, in the film, Louise does talk about the future to Ian, because what happens in the story, so the story opens, again, as we've already talked about, with sort of the description of Hannah. We have then the entire sequence in which the bulk of the film is, the meaning of the heptapods. And then at the end, her and Ian get together, and he says to her, do you want to make a baby? And she chooses to say yes, because she would rather have a life where she had experienced the joy of, having a daughter than not, even knowing the pain that would come with her eventual and unpreventable death, right? Which I think really works for the film. I think that doing a much truer adaptation in which you take sort of the ideas that Chang was really interested in, which is determinism, and placing that in film would be pretty challenging and also maybe less successful. And so I understand what Heiser did, and I think it benefits the film. Do you agree?
I don't know. There are a lot of changes that the film made to this story that I definitely think were necessary in order to fulfill the format and I guess the expectations of sort of a big budget sci-fi blockbuster audience, right? Like, we haven't quite gotten there, but expanding the scope and talking about geopolitics, making them more face-to-face, in person with the heptapods, all of those things make sense, right? Like, we're creating a spectacle when we create a film. We're not just telling a story, and especially a big sci-fi film like this has to feel big and like the stakes are high, and the novella is very sort of subdued in that sense.
Let's talk about those details. I think that we should mention that as the bulk of the film deals with the heptapods' arrival and then the quest to understand them. Forrest Whitaker, his character as sort of a leader within the military, he recruits Louise Banks to come and meet the heptapods. And so in the story, as we mentioned, there are 112 of these various mirror or TV-like things that descend around the globe. In the film, there are 12 massive, spaceship-sized, oval structures that hover above 12 locations in the world, right? And we see, rather than having Louise Banks and Ian / Gary communicate through the television screen or the mirror. They actually ascend into the spaceship. There is a barrier, but we see the heptapods, and they communicate with them directly, like within the same room, even though there is a slight like transparent barrier between them. A big difference with the communication is that though they do employ both the spoken and the written language, the written language is not. It's in the story. I think described as sort of like a continuous, like cursive, right? But within the film, they almost like a squid would. They shoot out an ink projection of the semigram that is described, so that the sentence or what they're trying to communicate, which was a nice way to sort of visualize the written language. I think that was a smart way to do that. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean that's kind of what I was talking about, right? Like you have to make it look fancier, and having a kind of like I think in the novella the aliens are described not literally, but the description comes off as like kind of dorky looking, and they made them big and otherworldly and kind of scary in the film, and to have them like drawing on a whiteboard would be not that cool, which is what happens in the novella. So doing the squid ink into the mist is a very visually striking way of communicating the same idea, which is that you know the entirety of the sentence before you write it.
I'm glad that you mentioned the word dorky, because I actually wrote in my margin notes of the story that it is just a dorkier story. Like there are like as the main characters sort of communicate, there are things like, Louise tries to communicate with the heptapods early on with the spoken language. So she tries to replicate the fluttering noise. And then, she says, "Not even close," I grumbled. And then Gary responds, "I'm impressed you can make sounds like that at all." And then she responds, "You should hear my moose call. Sends them running." Just like things that, oh man, like if somebody actually said that in real life, you might like give like a slight like, huh, but wouldn't actually find funny.
Yeah.
It's just kind of like a dorky thing to say, like within the context. And then also, there are just like these little bits dropped in here and there. So I found that amusing. So I think, the biggest difference, as you already pointed out, we've sort of touched upon, is like the geopolitical aspect of the story. And so some of the major conflict that arises is not between like the humans and the aliens, although that is maybe sort of the catalyst for the conflict, but rather how would we as human beings around the world react to an event like this, something that is frankly like incomprehensible, right? So the paranoia that is mentioned within the story of like the military and the Department of State is turned up, cranked up within the film, right? So there's a withholding of information from like what Louise Banks and Ian, what they discover as they communicate and start to develop a relationship and understanding of the heptapods. There is a desire for those in power to not share that information with what we consider as our enemies around the world, right? Like China being the center of this. And that is like totally missing from the story. In the story, it's quite collaborative. I think the 112 pairs of folks who are like communicating with different heptapods all work together. And there's a little bit of that. We sort of see the United States, sharing information with Australia at some points within the story, but the story reaches its climax when the fear of like weaponry sort of is sort of introduced. What did you think of that sort of being central to the plot of the film?
Yeah, it's similar to the above things. Like, okay, it ups the stakes. It makes it tense, right? It adds drama, which was lacking from the novella, and that's fine. It's not what it's about. It's very much not what it's about. But it does provide pacing and intensity into a story that is otherwise lacking those things.
Yeah. Timely. The film was released in 2016. Unstable political time. Not that there's ever really a stable political time nowadays. I think Brexit was very much, at the forefront of, political discussions within the context of Europe. And, as we can see, tensions continue to escalate rather than de-escalate. So it does, definitely still have some relevance, like within our, current political climate. And I think that's why it sort of fits nicely within the sphere of like sci-fi, which we haven't really been able to define, even from the beginning of the podcast. But if we think about it as sort of a use of technology to reflect contemporary issues in a way that is maybe not so on the nose, I think that this sort of fits nicely within like the recent events. But you're right. I do think that while that might constitute some of the more entertaining portions of the film, it isn't what the film is about. And I found that the way that the film was structured to kind of discuss Hannah, Louise's daughter, and the reveal towards the end of the film when she communicates with the heptapods and sort of gets an understanding of how they perceive time. There's a line when Louise says, after seeing a vision of her daughter, like, who is this child? And that's when it really clicks that, hey, she can now like see the future. And I thought that was just really clever. It's like it's a fantastic, if you haven't seen the film before, or if you've only seen it 2/3 of the film, that'll really hit. And I think that it's very special. If you haven't seen the film and you're listening to this podcast, sorry, but I still think that you should watch it.
You also just should not have been listening to this podcast.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts about the film? I think that we should return to the more philosophical discussion as a way of closing. But do you want to talk about any other plot points before we jump to that?
No, I mean, I think they can all be summed up with the thing that I have already said essentially twice now, which is that, yes, these had to be made, these changes had to be made, or additions had to be added, or subtractions had to be subtracted, although there wasn't too much taken out, right? One thing I would like to note is, as you mentioned, the process of learning the heptapod language was more collaborative in the story. It even mentions that other linguists who learn heptapod B and work closely with heptapod B develop the same changed sense of time. And there's moments in the novella where Dr. Banks and another linguist share like a knowing glance because they both recognize that they are experiencing things differently than the people that they are talking to in the same conversation. And that doesn't really happen in the film, which I kind of miss maybe, but also isn't central to the story or the plot, quite frankly.
I think we'll talk about at the end sort of which one we enjoyed more. But the one thing that I do want to just finish, bring it to a close as we talk about Story of Your Life and Arrival is how, while one is, obviously an adaptation of another, they are quite widely different in their conclusions, right? I think that we've talked about how in the film there is this idea that, like, Louise had the choice. She chose to have Hannah, right? Like that is something that she decided to do because she would rather have a life with Hannah and experience everything that she would experience with her daughter, knowing that she would pass away. Whereas in the story, I think it's far more about this idea that we don't have the ability to choose. We don't have free will. And it's very interesting that you had brought that up earlier because, Zach, question number 2, the more philosophical question that I had for you is, do you believe in free will?
And my answer is the same, actually, which is that I don't think it matters if I believe in free will or not, because it's not going to change my actions, right? Like, either I do believe in free will and I'm consciously making my choices, or I don't believe in free will and I'm doing the same things anyway, but for a different reason. And unfortunately, this is my very uninteresting answer to so many philosophical points of debate, such as, is there God? It doesn't actually impact anything that I'm doing. So I don't feel like it would benefit me to have an opinion on that.
Yeah.
Sorry to just.
Not at all. I am in a very similar position, and funny enough, I had thought that this would be a pretty interesting thing to discuss with students. Certainly not the students I have at the moment, but a couple of years ago I taught grade 10, and we read Slaughterhouse-Five, which is another piece of science fiction in which things seem to be predetermined, right? Billy Pilgrim is someone who can see the entirety of his life before him, and he just has the phrase, so it goes, to every sort of event that occurs. And I brought this conversation up with the students, does it matter if we have free will? They all believe that we have free will, right? And then I sort of, brought up various pieces of evidence that would suggest otherwise. And I don't, as a teacher, you maybe are hoping that something fruitful will come to sort of these philosophical questions. And I think that they found it interesting, but left in a similar position that you and I would be in, were we to have that question brought forth. It was like, oh, okay, well, it doesn't really matter, right? Like, I'm probably still going to end up doing the same thing, right? But it is, I don't know, I just found it is so central to this story and to, Slaughterhouse-Five, that it is, I think, worth bringing up, and especially in comparison to like the way that the film ends, which is
And I think there are maybe more interesting ways to frame that discussion, at least in the context of Arrival versus Story of Your Life, right? And to me, it really is about how we do things as opposed to why we do them. And I really liked Villeneuve's take about how it's not about choosing to have a child or not. It's about being able to find joy in everyday moments. And that, to me, aligns with Ted Chiang's moral, I'll say, of the novella, which is that, as you referenced earlier, it's about hearing the story and experiencing it as opposed to just knowing what's going to happen. So it doesn't matter if you are choosing that thing. You find something to enjoy. You find your own happiness and joy in that life. Which is, it's hard. It's, that's easier said than done. But that's, to me, the interesting point of the story.
Which did you enjoy more, the story or the film?
It's tough because I, too, love this film, and I have always, since I saw it, rated this movie very highly. I don't really have a top 5 movies list because I don't think about movies as much as you do in that way, but I could easily see Arrival cracking the top 5. But the short story was just so magical to me. I'm gonna have to go with Ted Chiang's version. What about yourself, Russell?
So I had obviously seen the film before we had embarked on this episode. I had gone over the story once before because, as I mentioned, within the, while I was teaching Slaughterhouse-Five, I thought like, oh, I wonder if there's an opportunity for me to watch this movie in class with kids. And a way to justify that would be to have them read the story. And after going over it with myself, I thought, maybe a little advanced for high school sophomores. Maybe not, but I thought that it would require, frankly, maybe more effort on my part than I was willing to give in to explain like the sentences of the structure of sentences and what would be necessary for students to understand some of these terms teleological being a big one as well. Like, it is to use it as sort of a mini lesson within like a larger unit. It seemed a little bit too much at the time, but maybe one day I'll be able to do that. I am really caught in a weird space here because, like you, I love this film, and it is one that I own in multiple modes at Blu-ray, and I own a digital copy as well. That's how much I enjoy it. It's also a film I really enjoy watching with people for the first time. So I've probably seen it many, many times because I always enjoy seeing how people react to the story and their take on what it's actually about. But man, the short story is so good. And reading it again today, as I was traveling from visiting my grandfather to come back here to where I live in Cape Town, I just had to marvel at the experience of reading it. So I might give a slight edge to the short story, which is baffling because I don't think that I would have said that before having read it again today.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about it over the course of our conversation, I think the short story or the novella, the written form by Ted Chiang, is simply a purer telling of this story and a purer way to convey these ideas. Which isn't to say that the movie is impure, but there's a lot of noise in there that had to be added to make it a Hollywood film. The geopolitical stuff, there's like a whole segment that we didn't even talk about because it doesn't matter, where some of the soldiers kind of mutiny and try to blow up the alien ship, and that affects essentially nothing in the story or the plot. And I was struck as I was watching the movie again after having read the novella, just how much of that is pretty extraneous to the story itself, to the core ideas, and to Louise Banks's story. So that, for me, gives it is one of the factors that gives it to the novella.
Well, Zach, thank you again for doing this with me. I have really enjoyed this episode, and I feel like we've got some momentum to be able to do this well and hopefully continue to get better. Thank you to everybody if you have listened. If you haven't had the chance to read Story of Your Life by Ted Chiang, but have seen Arrival, we cannot recommend this short story highly enough. You can find a PDF of it if you just type in Story of Your Life PDF on Google, so it is available to you. But I'm sure we can provide that link as well.
Yeah, it's also in books. You can get them at your library. You can purchase it. There's a collection of Ted Chiang short stories that I will link in the show notes. I've heard from other people, other faithful listeners who have written in, that the other short stories are also very good. I have not read them yet, but I'm sure I will eventually.
Yeah.
Because of how much I enjoyed this one.
Cool. Next episode, we will be discussing If Beale Street Could Talk by James Baldwin and adapted by Barry Jenkins. Neither Zach nor I have read or watched If Beale Street Could Talk. And so in preparation for next episode, I will be reading the story first and then watching the film. And we thought it would be interesting for Zach to do the opposite. So Zach is going to watch the film and then read the source text afterwards. So looking forward to that discussion. And any other closing thoughts, Zach?
Nope, it's going to be great. I'm excited. It's been great to talk about Arrival, Story of Your Life, a story that is dear to both of our hearts, and I look forward to diving into one that neither of us know much about.
Right.
Not next week, but next 2 weeks from now, which is our publishing cadence. So yeah, thanks again for everybody tuning in. We'll see you next time.